Defiance theory says we need to study the effects of sanctions on the sanctioned, that is, people who receive those sanctions, and to see whether those sanctions differ according to the type of sanction they receive. For example, restorative justice versus 10 years imprisonment, or both, versus the type of people being sanctioned, younger people versus older people, or male versus female, people who have a stake in the society through employment and family, then who don't. These are a part of the web of causation that keeps people from committing crimes or that promotes the likelihood that people will commit crimes. And answering those questions with empirical evidence can be a great challenge depending on the research design chosen. If you're experimenting with different types of people for different sanctions, you get different results. What you get is called the interaction effect. The interaction between the person, they are, or the type of situation that person is found, and the nature of the sanction, the way it is delivered, the perceived fairness of the process. Specific deterrence is a method of punishment in the criminal justice system that discourages future behavior in the specific individual charged with crime. That's different from other people who know that a person is punished and who are deterred themselves because they don't want to get punished like the person that got punished, which is called general deterrence. Sherman Lawrence wrote in 1993 the building theory of defiance. The standard doctrine of criminal law is when you punish somebody, you deter that individual from repeating their offense. That would be the doctrine of specific deterrence. Sherman calls it a doctrine and not a hypothesis. The law does not have an open-minded view of whether or not this claim is correct. It is doctrinally said we must assume that is the case to forward our duty to punish individuals to prevent them from doing crimes again. Sherman figured out when deterrence is the reaction, when irrelevance is the reaction, that punishing someone just runs off their back like water off a duck's back. And then the idea of defiance, the sanction actually makes them more likely to commit crimes in the future. Defiance theory has roughly 400 citations in the last 27 years between 1993 and 2020. Not a whole lot for a major theory, and there has been over 100 tests of various kinds of that theory in the literature. However, it does not have a systematic review that will classify the test into, for example, whether they're measured because of causal mechanism, or they were simply looking at correlational indicators of a defiance pattern or of a deterrence pattern. The status of the theory is still promising, but certainly is not strong. Experimental facts for theory to fit by 1993 with the domestic violence arrest experiments done by Sherman was he found opposite effects of the same sanctions. Two different kinds of offenders, or more than two, but certainly unemployed versus employed offenders, reacted very differently, as well as married versus unmarried. Most consistent finding was having a job made you much more prone to defiance theory not working. You would be deterred in part not by punishment, but by the shame, the stigmatization, the loss of the job, loss of standing in the community that would have gone along with the arrest and the prosecution if it occurred due to domestic violence. The group predisposed of defiance did not have the stigma and conformity to lose. They didn't have a job, a marriage, the standing in the community that having a criminal record would disrupt. What they did have was the humiliation of the process of being arrested, which seemed then you could infer, speculate the causal mechanism in between the arrest and the outcome of higher rates of domestic abuse. For the unemployed, that arrest was making them more violent, and for the employed people, it was making them less violent. The best experimental evidence that separates sanction decision from the pre-existing characteristics of those sanctioned. It shows if the pre-existing characteristics was being unemployed, it made them much more likely to have the punishment backfire. That is fact which has not been refuted and at the same time has completely been ignored by people who make criminal law. Key concepts of defiance theory include perceived legitimacy by potential offenders, what their social bonds are, how much shame they would feel from being arrested, or how much pride they would feel from being arrested. Propositions, imposition of law enforcing under different conditions is likely to cause one of three outcomes. The crime gets worse as a pattern of defiance, it gets better as a pattern of deterrence, or it doesn't change, which is the evidence of irrelevance. Defiance proposition says sanctions provoke future defiance of law, persistence more frequent or more serious violations. To the extent that offenders experience sanctioning conduct as illegitimate, that offenders have weak bonds to the sanctioning agent and community, and that offenders deny their shame and become proud of their isolation from the sanctioning community. This is when punishment backfires. Deterrence proposition says when punishment works, sanctions produce future deterrence of law-breaking, desistance, less frequent or less serious violations. To the extent that offenders experience sanctioning conduct as legitimate, that offenders have strong bonds to the sanctioning agent and community, and that offenders accept their shame and remain proud of solidarity with the community. Irrelevance is the bottom line, which a lot of people argue. They say, let's defund the police because they don't make any difference, or if they do, they make things worse. That is possible, and it is allowed in defiance theory. Sanctions may become irrelevant to future law-breaking effect to the extent that the factors encouraging defiance or deterrence are fairly evenly counterbalanced. So you may or may not have strong family ties but no jobs, or you got a job but poor family ties. They cancel each other out, punishment or not. Some studies that randomly assign cases to different judges who then give very different punishments on balance. Extremely punitive with some judges, not so punitive with other judges. Studies show no changes to the outcome of repeated offending. There is lots of evidence of irrelevant sanctions. What is the X? X, the independent variable that really drives the interaction of the punishment experience, is about the construction of legitimacy. Defiance theory is very concerned with the offender's perception of the moral right to rule by the punishing agent. That can be a perception that is individual. For example, this cop is picking on me. This cop is a racist. This cop is somebody who is unfair, who is actually more concerned about the authority of the police and being respected than he is about the due process of law. Or all cops have those characteristics, which would be a collective defiance against all of the authority for generalizing the defiance. Mala in se, or mala prohibita, the implication of mala prohibita is that there's a lot of rules or regulations that are not very important. There are lots of things that are illegal but not immoral under the rule of mala prohibita, and that could have a lot to do with defiance. Avoiding tautology, we have to avoid it, in which we equate legitimacy with the way you see the law, your compliance with the law can't be the measure of whether you can see the law as legitimate, because that is circular, a tautological argument. What we need is something dependent of the perception of legitimacy as a measure independent of whether the offender obeys the law or doesn't. The process of contesting the legitimacy of the law with the principle of legitimation around the contest need to be measured separately from the legitimacy, and the processes not just of lawbreaking but also, as Sutherland said, the domain of criminology is the process of lawmaking as well as reaction to lawbreaking. Substantiative principle of legitimation includes arguments for what's right or wrong based on different forms of authority, including religion, ideology, also rationality, which is pragmatism or identifying ethic. Sometimes a good ethic, like fighting climate change and being environmentally responsible. Sometimes a bad ethic like hating immigrants or hating people of a certain religion. The form of authority are all defective in a specific way of promoting legitimacy in the eyes of the beholder. We're concerned with how you delegitimize the criminal law through vocabularies of motive. For example, most frequently cited article in sociology is a 1957 piece called Techniques of Neutralization, in which the foremost idea is the idea of condemning the condemners. The person who condemns you has done something wrong themselves. They are not just guilty of hypocrisy, they are totally disabled from making a moral condemnation of fair behavior because they have not been perfect themselves. Other ways of approaching this includes codes of honor, your clan or your family, your community versus the state, your religious duty, and so on. Of course, with collusions of these different kinds of legitimation principles and the different values that they stand for. Positive legitimation, we have positive legitimation through human rights, substantiative equality, and procedural equality and fairness. Even empathy, which is now logically measured by neuroscience, by people imagining suffering pain by other people who they hear about or see as being in pain. We have different kinds of doctrines from the Old Testament and the New Testament in Christianity versus Islam and cultural traditions. Defiance is not just individual effects, it is also collective in response to specific targets like police. These are societal effects in which we are looking at general targets.